Close your eyes and travel back to an empire that ruled 3 continents for 600 years. From the deserts of Arabia to the walls of Vienna, the Ottomans shaped the world we live in today, through conquest, art, faith, and ambition. Tonight, you'll hear the rise and fall of a civilization that refused to fade quietly into history. So settle in, let your thoughts drift, and let this story carry you through centuries of power, beauty, and betrayal. If you enjoyed journeys like this, stay with us. And remember to subscribe for more timeless history. Before the world ever spoke the name Ottoman, the land itself carried whispers of empires already gone. The winds over Anatolia drifted across ruined fortresses, once Byzantine strongholds, now crumbling into the earth like forgotten prayers. Along the mountain passes, shepherds and wanderers walked among marble stones carved with faded crosses, reminders of a world in retreat. The Byzantines, proud heirs of Rome, still clung to Constantinople, a jewel walled in stone and faith. But beyond those gates, their reach grew thinner with each passing year. To the west lay kingdoms of Europe, fractured by their own wars, watching the east with both fear and disdain. To the east lay rival tribes in the fading shadow of the Seljuks, their power splintering like glass beneath a heavy hand. Between these worlds, the frontier was restless, filled with danger, but also with opportunity. Out of this shifting borderland rose a small clan, nomads hardened by exile, carrying with them not gold or treasure, but a name, Osman. Imagine them in their tents beneath a canopy of stars, the campfires burning low, horses tethered in silence, and the voices of storytellers weaving sagas into the night. In those tales, the frontier was not only geography, but destiny, a place where faith could be proven, where swords could carve kingdoms, and where men could rise from obscurity into legend. It was here, amid the uncertainty of dying empires and scattered tribes, that the roots of a new power began to take hold. A seed too small to be noticed by emperors and kings, yet one destined to grow into a tree whose branches would cast shadows across 3 continents. The contrasts were striking even then. The crumbling mosaics of Byzantine churches against the vibrant banners of nomadic riders, the silence of forgotten cities against the thunder of hooves sweeping across open plains. In that silence before the storm, history balanced on a knife's edge. And from the whispers of tents and valleys, the first notes of an empire began to stir, faint at first, like the distant beat of a drum. An empire not yet born, but already carried in the hearts of its people, waiting for dawn. There are moments in history when myth and truth blur so seamlessly that we cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. The story of Osman, the man whose name would become the foundation of the Ottoman Empire, begins not with conquest, but with a dream so vivid, so symbolic, that it was retold across centuries as if it carried the weight of prophecy. Whether it happened exactly as told, or whether it grew in the retelling, hardly matters. What matters is that this dream became a guiding star, a compass that pointed the way for a people who were destined to carve their name into history. Osman was not born a king. He was not raised in the marble palaces of Constantinople or schooled in the gilded courts of Europe. He was the son of a frontier chieftain, Ertugrul, who led his people, the Kayet tribe of Turks, across dangerous lands fractured by warlords and collapsing empires. Theirs was a life of survival, tents pitched and dismantled, Herds moved with the seasons. Swords kept sharp, not for glory, but for necessity. Yet, within this life of wandering hardship, a seed of greatness lay hidden. The story goes that one night Osman fell into a deep sleep while a guest in the home of a dervish, a wandering mystic named Sheikh Edebali. This sheikh was not merely a holy man, but a figure of spiritual authority, respected by warriors and peasants alike. His home was a place of prayer, of whispered verses, carried into the night. As Osman rested under that roof, his mind entered the realm of dreams, and in that dream a vision unfolded that would echo far beyond his lifetime. Osman dreamt that from his chest sprang forth a mighty tree. Its trunk rose tall and unshakable. Its branches stretched outward until they covered the entire world. Beneath its shade lay valleys and rivers, cities and fields, stretching farther than the eye could see. Mountains bent gently under its branches. Oceans glistened with reflected moonlight. And under that cosmic canopy, countless people lived and thrived, protected by the embrace of this tree. The tree, the dream said, was not merely Osman's. It was his legacy. It was the promise of a dynasty, of an empire that would spread like living roots across continents, weaving together lands and peoples. When Osman awoke, he told Sheikh Edebali of the vision. The mystic listened quietly, then smiled with the knowing calm of a man who understood symbols more deeply than words. He told Osman that this dream was no mere illusion. It was destiny. The tree was his house, his bloodline, and the empire that would rise from it. The world, Edebali said, was waiting for Osman to plant its roots. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss such tales as legend born of poetic imagination. But we must remember the world in which Osman lived. On the frontier, dreams were not idle fancies. They were seen as messages, signs from the divine, whispers carried from realms beyond sight. A vision of such scale was not something to be ignored. It was a torch passed from heaven to earth. And in that moment, Osman's life ceased to be ordinary. He carried within him a story too large to be denied. The dream became a banner, invisible at first, but powerful. It gave his followers a sense of destiny, something beyond raids and battles. When they rode across borderlands, they no longer saw themselves as wanderers scraping for survival. They saw themselves as the shadow of a future empire, branches destined to stretch into eternity. Think of the power of such a vision. Men fight for gold and honor, but visions bind generations. They whisper across time. They fuel patience, endurance, and sacrifice. A single dream transformed Osman from a tribal leader into the founder of an idea. And that idea was empire. Yet destiny, even when promised, demands proof. Osman's life after the dream was not free of hardship. He still had to lead his people against rival tribes. He still had to carve out space between the Seljuk rulers, the Mongol overseers, and the shrinking Byzantines. Each step forward was taken not with certainty, but with risk. Yet the dream framed these risks differently. Failure was temporary. Destiny was eternal. From this dream, we glimpse the central tension of the Ottoman story, the constant dance between myth and reality, between divine promise and human struggle. On the one hand, Osman's vision was ethereal, poetic, and unshakable. On the other, his daily life was one of dirt, sweat, and blood. The empire would not rise from visions alone. It would rise because Osman and his descendants fought, negotiated, conquered, and built, brick by brick, sword by sword, law by law. But the dream gave them something their enemies lacked: inevitability. The Byzantines defended what they had. The Seljuks clung to what they had lost. The Mongols ruled through fear of collapse. But the Ottomans? They believed the world itself would one day rest under their tree. That belief became a shield against despair, a fire against the cold. Notice the contrast. A lone nomadic chieftain sleeping under the roof of a mystic, dreaming of a tree that would cover the world. How fragile it seems. How impossible. And yet, history proves it true. The Ottoman Empire would grow to span 3 continents, ruling for over 6 centuries. The dream was not just a story. It was prophecy wrapped in metaphor, a truth hidden in the language of dreams. For us, listening centuries later, it holds a hypnotic pull. We drift into that vision ourselves, imagining the branches unfurling across the earth. We see Istanbul rising beneath it, minarets like delicate twigs piercing the sky. We see caravans moving like rivers, armies like storms, and palaces like blossoms opening beneath its shade. Osman's dream is more than a historical footnote. It is the heart of the Ottoman story. Without it, the empire is only conquest. With it, the empire is destiny. And as the dreamer awoke that morning in Sheikh Edebali's home, perhaps even he did not fully understand what it meant. But he carried it with him. His children would carry it. His empire would carry it. And even now, long after the tree has fallen, its branches remain etched into the memory of history. The whispers of that dream still drift across time, quiet but unshakable. They remind us that great empires do not begin with armies. They begin with visions. And sometimes, the most powerful empires of all begin with nothing more than the dream of a man lying under a roof of stars, daring to imagine the world his children might inherit. The Ottomans did not begin as an empire. They began as raiders on the edge of collapsing worlds, a small tribe in a sea of shifting powers. What makes their story remarkable is not only that they survived, but that within a century they transformed from obscure wanderers into a force that rivaled empires older, larger, and richer than themselves. This transformation was not a sudden leap, but a patient unfolding, like a seed germinating in the cracks of a fallen wall, slowly pushing its way into sunlight. To understand how this happened, we must return to the frontier, the borderlands of Anatolia at the end of the 13th century. This land was neither fully Byzantine nor fully Turkish. It was a fractured place where abandoned villages were repopulated by newcomers, where castles changed hands not once, but many times, and where faith itself became a rallying cry and a weapon. Here, on the margins, opportunity lived. Osman and his followers occupied precisely this liminal zone. They were Ghazis, warriors of the frontier, men who justified their raids not only by hunger and ambition, but by the banner of faith. Against the Byzantines, they could frame their battles as holy struggle. Against rival Turkish tribes, they could claim the mantle of rightful heirs to Seljuk legitimacy. This double-edged narrative gave them flexibility, a cloak that allowed them to operate as both conquerors and defenders, depending on who was listening. Picture the early Ottoman raids. Not vast armies, not polished legions, but swift bands of horsemen cutting across plains, night descents on villages, sieges on small fortresses whose guards were weary and undermanned, smoke rising against a backdrop of forests and mountains. For the Byzantines, Each raid was a thorn, painful, but not yet fatal. But for the Ottomans, each raid was fuel, new land to settle, new families to feed, new warriors to attract. Slowly, what began as raiding shifted into something more lasting. The Ottomans did not simply plunder, they stayed. They established garrisons, appointed leaders, and built mosques in captured towns. A cycle began. Raid, conquer, settle, expand. With each victory, their sphere grew larger, their identity firmer. What once was a wandering tribe became, step by step, a state. The contrast here is striking. On one side, the Byzantines, defenders of an empire 1,000 years old, heirs to Rome itself, yet hollowed by centuries of wars, plagues, and intrigues. Their walls were mighty, but their treasury was thin. Their armies marched with banners of gold, but their numbers dwindled. On the other side, the Ottomans, poor in resources but rich in conviction. Their warriors were untested in grand campaigns, but relentless on the frontier. One side clung desperately to survival. The other surged with the vitality of growth. It was not only strength of arms that lifted the Ottomans. It was also their ability to weave together diverse peoples. The Byzantine frontier was home to Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Turks, and countless others. Many of these populations were weary of distant rulers, weary of taxation, weary of neglect. The Ottomans, by offering stability and protection, drew these groups into their fold. Converts to Islam joined their ranks. Christian peasants paid tax, but were often left to till their fields in peace. In time, this pragmatic tolerance became one of the quiet strengths of Ottoman rule. Consider the symbolism. Byzantine churches rising beside Ottoman mosques, their bells and calls to prayer echoing through the same valleys. Markets where traders spoke in multiple tongues, exchanging silk, grain, and spices under banners of both cross and crescent. The frontier was not merely a place of conflict, it was also a place of blending. And the Ottomans learned to thrive in that blending, drawing energy from diversity rather than being fractured by it. By the early 14th century, Osman's successors, his son Orhan especially, began to transform these scattered conquests into something more structured. Bursa, once a Byzantine stronghold, fell to the Ottomans in 1326. It became their first true capital, a city of markets, mosques, and administration. For the first time, the Ottomans were not merely riders of the frontier, but rulers of a city, guardians of walls, and keepers of a treasury. Bursa glowed like a jewel in their growing crown, a sign that the seed Osman had planted was now taking root. Orhan's reign also marked another step toward empire, the creation of an army more permanent than raiders. The Ottomans began to rely on organized infantry and cavalry, and eventually, in later decades, the Devshirme system would be born, a controversial but effective method of recruiting Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and training them into elite soldiers known as Janissaries. Though this innovation lay ahead, its seeds were already visible in the Ottomans' growing desire for permanence and discipline. With each passing decade, the frontier shifted. What was once the edge of the Ottoman world became its heartland. The river valleys that once separated Turk from Greek became veins running through Ottoman domains. And with each shift, the dream Osman once carried, that mighty tree, seemed less like a vision and more like a reality slowly, inexorably unfolding. But every ascent carries its shadows. For every victory, rivals sharpened their swords. The Byzantine emperors, though weakened, were not yet finished. Other Turkish beyliks, jealous of Ottoman rise, plotted and resisted. Even the distant Mongols, whose empire still loomed over Asia, cast a shadow across Anatolia. To grow, the Ottomans had to balance carefully, moving like water around obstacles, flowing steadily toward the sea. Their greatest weapon was not brute force, but patience. They did not attempt to swallow vast territories at once. Instead, they chipped away fortress by fortress, valley by valley, and in this patience lay their strength. An empire is not built overnight. It is built through persistence. The Ottomans understood this truth better than many of their rivals. When we look back now, it seems inevitable, a small tribe swelling into empire, but in the moment it was fragile. A single defeat could have erased them. A stronger Byzantine push, a more unified Turkish rival, a wave of Mongol pressure, any of these could have snuffed out the Ottomans before their story began. Yet none of these happened. Why? Some would say strategy, others luck, and still others destiny. The dream Osman saw was not yet fulfilled, but perhaps the world itself bent gently to make room for its unfolding branches. The frontier shaped the Ottomans in ways that would never leave them. Even as they grew into an empire stretching across continents, they always carried the memory of those early days. The raiders in the night, the shifting alliances, the blending of cultures. It gave them flexibility, resilience, and a sense of mission that far outlasted Osman himself. From frontier to empire, the Ottomans walked a path lined with both peril and promise. Their rise was not the fall of others alone, but the careful weaving of a new order from the broken threads of the old. And as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the world began to sense that a new power was rising, one that would soon turn its eyes to the greatest prize of all, Constantinople itself. There are moments when history itself seems to pause, holding its breath as worlds collide. One such moment came in the spring of 1453, when the rising Ottoman tide met the last great wall of Byzantium. For centuries, Constantinople had stood unconquered, the shining jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. Its massive Theodosian walls had repelled countless sieges, defying Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders. To capture it was to grasp not only a city, but the weight of destiny. At the heart of this storm was Sultan Mehmed II, remembered as the Conqueror. Barely 21 years old, yet already a figure of immense ambition, he saw Constantinople not merely as a prize, but as the fulfillment of prophecy. Islamic tradition spoke of a great commander who would one day seize the city. Byzantine prophecies whispered of doom approaching from the east. For Mehmed, destiny and desire fused into one. He would be that conqueror, and history would bend around his will. In April 1453, his armies surrounded the ancient city. Imagine the scene. Nearly 80,000 Ottoman soldiers encamped in a vast ring of fire and tents, their banners fluttering against the sky. War drums beat in unison, echoing like thunder across the Bosporus. The defenders inside numbered perhaps 7,000, a mix of Byzantine citizens and a few desperate allies, a city of walls and faith, yet hollowed, exhausted, and alone. What tipped the balance was not only numbers, but innovation. Mehmed brought with him monstrous cannons, bronze giants cast by the engineer Orban, capable of hurling stone balls the size of oxen. For weeks, the cannons roared against the Theodosian walls, shaking ancient stone that had stood for 1,000 years. Smoke, dust, and echoes of thunder filled the air. The contrast was stark, the old world trembling beneath the weapons of the new. Inside the city, hymns rose in Hagia Sophia. By candlelight, priests and people prayed for deliverance. The mosaics glimmered, saints watching silently as stones cracked and towers fell. Outside, the crescent banners glowed in torchlight, carried by soldiers certain that God and destiny walked with them. On May 29th, the storm finally broke. Before dawn, Mehmed ordered the final assault. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged forward. The first lines fell in heaps, but more pressed on. The walls, weakened by weeks of cannon fire, gave way in places. Chaos spread. Trumpets and shouts clashed with bells and cries. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine IV, is said to have thrown aside his crown and charged into the fray, disappearing into legend. By mid-morning, the unthinkable had happened. Constantinople had fallen. After more than 1,000 years, the capital of Byzantium was no more. Mehmed rode through its gates, awe in his eyes as he entered Hagia Sophia. Where once hymns had filled the dome, now prayers of the Quran echoed, declaring the city reborn as Istanbul. This moment was more than conquest, it was transformation. With Constantinople's fall, the Ottomans crossed from frontier rulers into empire. The city became their capital, their heart, their bridge between continents. For Europe, it was a shock. The bastion of Christendom toppled. For the Ottomans, it was a dawn. The prophecy of Osman's dream unfolding branch by branch. The fall of Constantinople stands as both an ending and a beginning. The last flicker of Byzantium extinguished, the first blaze of an Ottoman golden age ignited. Light became shadow, and shadow became light. And from that day forward, the world would no longer look east and see weakness. It would see the crescent rising, steady and unstoppable. With Constantinople transformed into Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire entered a new rhythm, one of splendor, expansion, and cultural flowering. If the fall of the city was dawn, then the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent was midday, the empire at its brightest, its branches stretching wide, casting shade across Europe, Asia, and Africa alike. This was the Golden Age, an era remembered for grandeur, yet woven through with shadows. Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520, and from the very beginning, he carried himself as more than a king. He was Padishah, Sultan of Sultans, Caliph of Islam, shadow of God on earth. His empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the coastlines of North Africa to the plains of Mesopotamia. Few rulers in history commanded so vast a domain, and yet Suleiman's greatness was not measured by conquest alone. He was a man of contrasts. On the battlefield, he was relentless, his armies disciplined, his cannons thunderous. But in the palace, he was a poet, a patron of the arts, a lover of calligraphy and music. His laws gave order to diverse peoples, balancing the weight of justice with the mercy of faith. He was warrior and scholar, conqueror and dreamer. Under his reign, Istanbul became a jewel of civilization, its skyline crowned with domes and minarets, its markets humming with traders from every corner of the known world. Picture those markets, the scent of spices drifting in the air, silks glowing in candlelight, voices in Turkish, Greek, Arabic, Persian, Italian, all mingling like notes in a song. Caravans arrived from the Silk Road, ships from Venice and Alexandria docked in the harbors, their goods spilling into a city that seemed to breathe commerce and culture in equal measure. The empire was no longer a frontier power. It was a hub, a heart through which the world's lifeblood flowed. Yet even in such brilliance, shadows moved quietly. The palace glittered with jewels, but within its walls whispers echoed. Intrigue stirred in the harem, rivalries brewed among viziers, and the very abundance of power bred new dangers. For while Suleiman's justice reached far, it could not silence ambition, and so the golden age was balanced, splendor against secrecy, order against conspiracy. In this balance, the empire found both strength and fragility. For the people, life under Suleiman often meant stability. Farmers tilled their land, traders prospered, scholars taught in madrasas, and architects like Sinan reshaped the empire's skyline with mosques of breathtaking harmony. These monuments still stand, stone dreams etched against the sky, silent reminders of a time when the Ottomans believed they were the center of the world. But beneath this order lay a deeper truth. Every golden age carries the seed of its own decline. The same wealth that built mosques also bred complacency. The same influence that drew artists and thinkers also invited corruption. The same palace that glowed with light was shadowed by intrigue. This is the duality of Suleiman's reign, a reign remembered as magnificent, yet woven through with contradictions. It was an era of high achievement, yet also of quiet tension. A moment when the tree Osman once dreamed of seemed strongest, its branches lush and far-reaching, yet when its roots began, almost imperceptibly, to strain against the soil that sustained them, the golden age glowed, dazzling all who looked upon it. But even golden light casts deep shadows. When we think of empires, we often picture battlefields, thrones, and monuments. But some of the greatest shifts in Ottoman history did not begin on open plains or in grand halls. They began behind veils, within quiet corridors, in a place few men ever saw, the imperial harem. To outsiders, the harem was shrouded in mystery, often misrepresented as nothing more than a den of indulgence. Yet in truth, it was a world of politics, strategy, and influence. It was here that women, often underestimated by chroniclers of war and state, shaped the fate of the empire. The harem was both sanctuary and battlefield, a place where whispers could alter the course of nations. At the center of this world was the Sultan's household, populated by wives, concubines, mothers, daughters, and servants. Their lives may have been confined within gilded walls, but their reach extended far beyond. For the women of the harem wielded a power subtler than armies, the power of influence, counsel, and succession. Consider the story of Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. She entered the palace as a slave, taken from the lands of Ruthenia, but through wit, intelligence, and unshakable will, she became the favored consort, and later the legal wife, of Suleiman the Magnificent himself. Her rise was extraordinary, not only because of her background, but because she broke traditions that had stood for centuries. By marrying her, Suleiman set aside the old custom of keeping consorts as concubines, elevating Hurrem to a place of legitimacy and prestige. But Hurrem was more than a wife. She was a strategist. She influenced court decisions, advised the Sultan, and ensured her children were positioned for succession. Letters between her and Suleiman reveal not a passive figure, but an active partner in governance, shaping diplomacy and policy with her counsel. In her hands, the harem was not merely a place of seclusion, it was a political stage. This dynamic marked the beginning of what historians later called the Sultanate of Women, a period when mothers, wives, and daughters of the sultans played critical roles in state affairs. Some guided their sons through childhood regencies, others acted as regents themselves, issuing decrees and negotiating with foreign powers. The empire that appeared to be ruled by men alone was, in truth, often balanced on the decisions of women whose influence flowed invisibly through palace corridors. Imagine the contrast. On one side, armies marching beneath banners, cannons roaring across fortresses, viziers debating in council chambers. On the other, a candle-lit room within the harem, where women spoke in hushed tones, exchanged letters, and plotted alliances. The empire's strength was forged as much in those quiet rooms as in the clash of swords. The harem itself was a world within a world. Its architecture mirrored its purpose, enclosed, layered, and secretive. Golden lattices veiled windows, preventing outsiders from peering in. Marble courtyards echoed with the steps of attendants, while fountains whispered among jasmine gardens. Rooms were richly adorned, but their beauty masked the weight of tension. Who would rise? Who would fall? Who would capture the sultan's ear? For the women inside, survival depended on more than beauty. Intelligence, diplomacy, loyalty, and timing determined their fates. The stakes were immense, for the harem was bound directly to succession. A favored son could inherit the empire, a neglected one might face exile, or worse. In Ottoman tradition, fratricide was a grim reality, with princes often pitted against each other in struggles for the throne. Thus, the harem was not merely a place of love, it was a crucible of survival, where mothers fought to secure the future of their children. Hurrem's story illustrates this vividly. She maneuvered not only for Suleiman's favor, but for the survival and ascension of her sons. Rivalries within the harem grew fierce. Alliances formed and broke like shifting tides. Each whisper carried the weight of dynasties. And when decisions in the harem spilled outward, they altered the empire itself. The influence of these women was not limited to politics. Many became patrons of architecture, education, and charity. Mosques, schools, hospitals, and fountains across the empire bear inscriptions of their names. Through these works, they extended their presence beyond palace walls, shaping the daily lives of ordinary subjects. In these stones and waters, their legacy became tangible, even if veiled by the chronicles of kings. Yet, as with all power, the harem's influence was double-edged. For every moment of stability it offered, there was also the risk of factionalism. For every charitable endowment, there was suspicion of manipulation. Some historians blamed the Sultanate of women for weakening the empire, suggesting that intrigue distracted rulers from governance. Others argue the opposite, that without these women, the empire might have fractured sooner. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between. What is undeniable is that the harem added a profound dimension to Ottoman rule. It blurred the line between private and public, between family and state. The Sultan was not only a ruler, but a father, a husband, a son, and those ties of blood and affection could not be neatly separated from the affairs of empire. The harem ensured that behind every decision stood not only the will of the Sultan, but also the unseen influence of those closest to him. And so, the empire of swords and cannons was also an empire of whispers and silken veils. To truly understand the Ottomans, one must look not only to the battlefields of Europe or the deserts of Arabia, but also to the quiet chambers where women shaped destiny with words as sharp as steel. The contrast could not be greater. Public order forged in law and conquest, private chaos swirling in gilded rooms. Together, they created a balance that defined the Ottoman story, a reminder that power wears many faces and that sometimes the most decisive hands in history are the ones we never see. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire stood at a threshold. It was no longer only a power of the East, nor merely a conqueror of former Byzantine lands. It was a bridge, an empire poised on the edge of two worlds, touching both Europe and Asia, Islam and Christendom, tradition and modernity. And it was in this space between worlds that its identity became both its strength and its burden. The empire's armies pushed deep into Europe. Ottoman banners flew over Hungary, the Balkans, and beyond. Twice, they stood before the gates of Vienna, their cannons poised, their soldiers ready to flood into the heart of Christendom. For Europeans, the Ottomans were both fear and fascination, the shadow at the border, the storm always threatening to break. To stand against the Sultan was to stand against what seemed an unstoppable tide. Yet, alongside the clash of armies flowed a quieter exchange. Ottoman markets absorbed goods from Europe, while European courts marveled at Ottoman fabrics, spices, and music. Diplomats carried stories home of Istanbul's glittering palaces, its call to prayer echoing over domes and towers. Venetian merchants, French ambassadors, and English travelers returned with tales of a world that felt both alien and alluring. The Ottomans were at once enemy and inspiration, threat and wonder. This duality defined their place in history. They were the empire of contrasts, a sword pointed westward and a hand extended eastward. They carried faith into battle, yet welcomed diversity into their markets. They besieged cities, yet built bridges of commerce. They were, in every sense, a civilization straddling thresholds. But such a position came with tension. For the Ottomans, expansion into Europe was more than ambition. It was a test of identity. Could an empire rooted in the traditions of Islam rule lands steeped in Christian heritage without fracturing? Could the branches of Osman's dream grow equally strong in different soils? Each campaign, each treaty, each cultural exchange was an answer to that question. Sometimes triumphant, sometimes uncertain. Standing at the edge of two worlds gave the Ottomans a unique power. But it also stretched them thin, forcing them to balance endlessly, never fully at rest. Their empire was a doorway, always open, never closed, and it was through this doorway that both glory and challenge entered. Every empire carries within it the seeds of decline. For the Ottomans, this decline did not come in a single blow, nor in a sudden collapse. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the fading of daylight into dusk. The tree Osman once dreamed of still stood tall, its branches vast and heavy, but cracks began to appear in the trunk, and shadows lengthened across its roots. The 16th century had ended in glory, but the 17th began to reveal strain. The empire's borders stretched wide, yet wide borders require watchful eyes, strong armies, and endless resources. The great conquests that had once fed its strength slowed, and with them the flow of wealth that expansion had brought. Victories became harder, defeats more common, and the aura of invincibility that had once cloaked the Ottomans began to fray. Wars with Europe reflected this shift. The failed sieges of Vienna in 1529 and again in 1683 symbolized the limits of Ottoman power. Once the terror of Christian Europe, The empire now faced coalitions of states united to resist it. Where once they had marched with confidence into foreign lands, the Ottomans now found themselves defending their own frontiers, reacting instead of advancing. The tide had begun to turn. But decline is never only military. It is also political, economic, and spiritual. Within the palace, intrigue deepened. The once strong practice of succession, though brutal, had given the empire firm rulers. But by the 17th century, traditions shifted. Sultans were no longer battle-hardened warriors raised on the frontier. Instead, princes were kept confined in the palace, growing up in luxury and isolation. Some emerged wise and capable, but others emerged untested, unready, or unwilling to bear the weight of empire. This change weakened the very heart of leadership. Where Suleiman had been both conqueror and poet, later sultans often became figureheads, overshadowed by viziers, generals, or factions within the harem. Power drifted like smoke from one chamber to another, harder to pin down, harder to direct. The empire still stood, but its center no longer held with the same strength. Economically, new challenges gnawed at its foundations. The old trade routes that had once enriched Istanbul began to wither as European ships carved new paths around Africa and across the Atlantic. Spices and silks flowed directly to European ports, bypassing the Ottoman heartlands. The markets of Istanbul still bustled, but their lifeblood thinned, and with silver flooding Europe from the Americas, inflation surged, shaking the empire's economy and fueling unrest among soldiers and peasants alike. The Janissaries, once the disciplined elite, reflected this decay. These soldiers, recruited in youth and trained in loyalty, had been the pride of the empire, a force feared across continents. But over time, discipline slackened. Privileges crept in. Janissaries married, entered trades, and resisted reforms. They grew powerful, not only as warriors, but as a political faction. At times, they even rose against the Sultan himself, toppling rulers, enforcing their will with the very swords once raised in service of the state. The empire's shield had become a dagger, pointed inward. Religious authority, too, began to fracture. The Ottomans had long balanced their role as caliphs with pragmatic governance, allowing diverse peoples to live under their rule with relative tolerance. But as decline deepened, factions within Islam debated the empire's legitimacy, questioning whether its rulers still upheld divine justice. This erosion of spiritual confidence mirrored the erosion of political power. When an empire begins to doubt itself, the cracks widen faster. And yet, for all this, decline in the Ottoman world was not collapse. It was slow, layered, and paradoxical. Even as the empire weakened, it endured. Wars were lost, yet territories remained vast. Corruption festered, yet trade continued. Weak rulers came and went, yet the empire outlived them. It was as though the weight of centuries, the sheer momentum of the Ottoman machine, kept it alive long after its peak had passed. The metaphor of a candle is fitting here. The empire burned brightly once, illuminating half the world. Now the flame flickered lower, but it did not extinguish. Wax melted slowly, unevenly, but the candle remained upright, glowing in twilight. Decline in slow motion meant that generations lived and died under Ottoman banners without sensing final collapse. To them, the empire was still eternal, still vast, still powerful, even if history, watching from above, saw the slow fading. This duality is perhaps what makes Ottoman decline so hypnotic to recall. It was not tragedy in a single act, but drama stretched across centuries. One could walk through Istanbul and still see mosques rise, markets bustle, and ships glide across the Bosporus. Yet beneath the surface, debts mounted, rebellions flared, and neighbors grew stronger. Order and decay coexisted side by side. For the Ottomans themselves, this long twilight required adaptation. Some sultans attempted reforms, seeking to modernize armies or streamline administration. Some succeeded in moments, sparking flashes of revival. Others failed, their efforts drowned in resistance. The empire, like a great ship, carried too much weight, too much history, to change swiftly. Its size, once a strength, became its burden. By the 18th century, Europe surged ahead. Science, exploration, and industry reshaped the Western world. New ideas of governance, revolution, and nationhood took root. The Ottomans watched, sometimes imitating, sometimes resisting, always caught between preserving tradition and embracing change. To move too fast risked losing identity. To move too slowly risked irrelevance. The balance, once their gift, became their curse. And so, century after century, the empire lingered in this twilight, not gone, not whole, but enduring in the liminal space between greatness and collapse. To outsiders, it seemed both eternal and fragile. To its people, it was both a source of pride and a source of frustration. To history, it was a lesson in the quiet power of slow decline. The story of the Ottoman Empire's fall is not one of sudden fire, but of gradual fading. It is the story of dusk settling slowly. So slowly that only when the stars appear do we realize the day is gone. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the storm that had once battered Europe's gates. It was a shadow of its former self, vast in territory, yet fragile in strength, a body still standing, but weakened from within. To its neighbors, it became known by a haunting phrase, the sick man of Europe. The name carried both pity and menace, a reminder that the giant who had once inspired fear now seemed destined for collapse. The empire still stretched across 3 continents, but those lands were no longer secure. Nationalist movements began to stir among subject peoples. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, Arabs, each inspired by the rising tide of nationalism sweeping across Europe. Where once diversity had been a strength, it now became a fault line. Rebellion sparked like brush fires. Some were put down with force, others succeeded, tearing away pieces of the empire's once seamless tapestry. Externally, the great powers of Europe circled like wolves. Britain, France, Russia, and later Austria and Germany saw the Ottomans not as equals, but as prey, a weakening empire whose lands, ports, and trade routes could be carved and controlled. The Eastern Question, as it was called in European politics, revolved around one central issue: who would inherit the Ottoman lands once the empire finally fell? To the Ottomans themselves, this scrutiny was suffocating. Every rebellion, every financial crisis, every war seemed magnified by European intervention. At times, Britain or France stepped in to prop the empire up, not out of sympathy, but to prevent rivals from gaining too much influence. At other times, those same powers pushed the Ottomans into debt, forcing reforms that eroded sovereignty. The empire lived not by its own will alone, but by the calculations of foreign capitals. Economically, the situation grew dire. Wars had drained the treasury, and industrialization in Europe left the Ottomans behind. Factories in London, Paris, and Berlin produced goods cheaper and faster than Ottoman workshops could. European merchants dominated trade, while Ottoman industries stagnated. To finance modernization efforts, the empire borrowed heavily from European banks. By the mid-1800s, debts piled so high that foreign creditors effectively controlled the empire's finances. A nation that once taxed the riches of 3 continents now struggled to pay its bills. Reform became both a necessity and a paradox. Sultans and statesmen recognized the need to modernize. Armies had to be rebuilt, schools established, infrastructure developed. The Tanzimat reforms of the mid-19th century sought to reshape the empire with European-style institutions, promising equality before the law and centralized governance. But reforms were uneven. For some, they symbolized hope of renewal. For others, they felt like betrayal and abandonment of tradition in favor of Western imitation. Instead of uniting the empire, reforms often deepened divisions. Meanwhile, the Janissaries, once the empire's elite warriors, had been abolished in the 1820s after centuries of corruption and resistance to change. Their violent end, known as the Auspicious Incident, marked both a step toward modernization and a reminder of how deeply rooted the empire's problems had become. Removing them did not heal the state. It merely exposed new fractures. On the battlefield, the Ottomans could still fight, but victories were rare and defeats devastating. The Crimean War of the 1850s, fought alongside Britain and France against Russia, gave a temporary illusion of strength, but it also revealed how dependent the empire had become on foreign aid. Later, wars against Russia and Balkan states stripped away more lands. Each treaty seemed to shrink the map of Ottoman power until the once vast empire resembled a body slowly withering limb by limb. In the capital, Istanbul remained a city of contrasts. Along the Bosporus, new palaces rose in European styles, their facades glittering with chandeliers and mirrors. Steamships glided past wooden kayaks, and telegraph lines connected the empire to the wider world. Yet behind this veneer of modernity, poverty spread. Rural provinces languished under heavy taxes, corruption flourished, and peasants bore the weight of decline. The empire glittered in moments, but struggled in substance. The phrase "sick man of Europe" captured this contradiction. To European powers, the Ottomans were weak, yet too significant to ignore. Their land sat on vital crossroads: the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Middle East. No empire could afford to let the Ottomans fall without risking imbalance. And so, like a patient kept alive by reluctant doctors, the empire endured, propped up by foreign intervention, delayed in its inevitable demise. For the Ottomans themselves, this was a period of humiliation and resilience intertwined. They were mocked as decayed, yet they endured far longer than many expected. Their rulers oscillated between hope for revival and despair at decay. Some dreamed of pan-Islamism, rallying Muslims across the world to strengthen the caliphate. Others dreamed of constitutional government, looking to parliaments and reforms to renew legitimacy. All were attempts to breathe life back into the sick man. Yet history is rarely merciful. The 19th century closed with the empire weakened, and the 20th opened with storm clouds of global war. The sick man of Europe had survived longer than expected, but he could not endure forever. His body carried centuries of glory and scars alike. His breath still lingered, but each exhale grew shallower. The twilight of the Ottoman Empire was now unmistakable. The great tree Osman once dreamed of still stood, but its leaves had thinned, its bark cracked, and its roots strained against a changing world. The final chapter was approaching, and it would come not through gradual fading alone, but through the violent upheaval of a world at war. The final centuries of the Ottoman Empire were not marked by a single dramatic collapse, but by a long twilight. Yet, as the 20th century dawned, twilight darkened into night. What had once been a dynasty of warriors, poets, and rulers now stood at the mercy of powers greater than itself, not just the armies of rivals, but the unstoppable tides of modernity, nationalism, and global war. The empire entered the First World War not from strength, but from desperation. The leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress, the so-called Young Turks, believed that aligning with Germany and Austria-Hungary might offer one last chance to restore Ottoman power. But this decision tethered the empire to a war it could not afford, on fronts it could not sustain. The dream of revival soon dissolved into a struggle for survival. Across deserts, mountains, and seas, Ottoman soldiers fought with courage, yet the empire itself lacked the resources to endure. In Arabia, British officers like T.E. Lawrence stirred rebellion among tribes, promising independence in exchange for revolt. The Arab Revolt of 1916 split the empire's heartlands, turning once loyal provinces into battlegrounds. In the Caucasus, harsh winters and Russian offensives claimed countless lives. And along the Gallipoli Peninsula, the empire experienced both triumph and tragedy. Gallipoli remains one of the last great flashes of Ottoman resilience. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, Ottoman soldiers repelled Allied invasions, holding the cliffs and beaches against overwhelming naval power. The victory inspired pride, proving that even a sick man could still defend its home. But Gallipoli was a spark in a gathering storm. Beyond that moment, defeats mounted, lands fell away, and exhaustion deepened. By 1918, the war had drained the empire's lifeblood. Starvation spread across cities. Villages emptied. The treasury was bare, and the army, once feared across continents, staggered under the weight of casualties. The armistice signed in October 1918 was less a negotiation than a surrender. Foreign troops entered Istanbul, the city that had been the Ottoman heart for nearly 5 centuries. The Crescent banner still fluttered above minarets, but its authority was hollow. For many Ottomans, this occupation was unbearable humiliation. The empire that had once taken Constantinople now saw its own capital patrolled by British, French, and Italian soldiers. Palaces that had once dazzled visitors with Ottoman grandeur were overshadowed by the presence of foreign banners. Across the provinces, despair mingled with anger. The end had come, yet it did not arrive with sudden finality. It arrived with the slow, heavy weight of inevitability. And then, in the very moment of collapse, resistance emerged. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, refused to accept foreign rule. From the heart of Anatolia, he began to gather support, uniting soldiers, villagers, and intellectuals into a movement of defiance. What followed was not merely a war of independence, but a rebirth. The Turkish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1923, dismantled the last remnants of Ottoman rule and forged a new identity rooted not in empire, but in nationhood. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. Mehmed VI, the last sultan, left Istanbul aboard a British warship, a quiet departure that symbolized centuries of power slipping silently into the sea. A year later, in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as its first president. The Caliphate itself, the religious mantle the Ottomans had carried since the 16th century, was abolished soon after, severing ties to a past that had defined the empire's very soul. And so, the Ottoman Empire, which had endured for more than 600 years, passed into history. But endings are rarely absolute. Though the empire itself dissolved, its echoes remained, and remain still. Istanbul, the city once reborn in Mehmed the Conqueror's triumph, continues to stand as the living memory of Ottoman grandeur. Its skyline is crowned with the domes and minarets raised during centuries of rule. The Suleimaniye Mosque, the Blue Mosque, the fountains and palaces of Topkapi and Dolmabahce, all speak in stone, telling of a time when the Ottomans believed their city was the center of the world. Beyond architecture, the Ottoman legacy lingers in culture and law, in cuisine and music, in language and memory. The empire's unique system of governance, balancing tolerance with authority, faith with pragmatism, influenced societies across the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa. Coffee houses, once thriving in Ottoman Istanbul, spread across the globe. Dishes that trace their roots to Ottoman kitchens are still savored today. Even words in modern languages carry Ottoman echoes, fragments of a world that no longer exists, yet continues to shape the present. The empire also left behind questions about identity, about faith, about the tension between tradition and change. For Turkey, the successor state, the Ottoman past became both burden and inspiration. For former provinces, memories of Ottoman rule carried both pride and resentment. And for the world, the Ottomans became a reminder of how empires rise, flourish, and fade, leaving behind shadows longer than their lifespans. To speak of the Ottoman twilight is to speak of contrasts. It was a time of despair and renewal, collapse and rebirth, endings and beginnings. The empire that had once united vast lands dissolved, yet from its ashes rose a republic that would chart its own path into modernity. In this duality lies the true echo of the Ottomans. They were not merely conquerors or rulers, but dreamers, visionaries, carriers of a legacy that transcends their fall. And so, as we close this story, we return to the image of Osman's dream. The tree that sprang from his chest grew across centuries, shading continents, feeding generations, reaching skyward with ambition. Its branches eventually withered, its trunk split, its leaves fell. But the roots remain deep in the soil of history. Walk through Istanbul today. Hear the call to prayer echo across the Bosporus. Taste the food, feel the weight of stone beneath your feet, and you will sense those roots still alive, still whispering. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its twilight is not silence. It is a lingering music, a resonance carried across time. The empire has ended, yet the echoes continue, in memory, in culture, in stone and song. And perhaps they always will.